Before we begin, I need to thank you all for 3 million views. Didn't expect to get that much on my first video, so I completely lost my mind. Speaking of lost minds, FromSoft fans are a bizarre species. Hailing from all over the globe, united by their love of pain and confusion, and their obsession with twinks with snakes, and old ladies spewing vague yet tragic exposition, they all agree that From Software makes some of the best games out there. And they're right. Most of them believe Dark Souls 1 and 3 are some of the highest peaks ever achieved in gaming history. And I agree with that, but they don't show the same love to Dark Souls 2, the black sheep of the FromSoft lineup. Why didn't it get the same amount of love as the other games? Is it just a lack of quality or a more specific flaw in the game's design? To answer that, we need to consider something. All art is a form of communication between an artist and the audience, and games are designed to give their players an ideal intended experience that gives them the perfect blend of emotions and ideas they need to engage with the world, or to simply enjoy the gameplay without thinking too hard about it. However, there are lower and upper limits to this kind of communication. A recent example of too much communication is the modern trend of characters solving puzzles before giving you a chance to think, like in this example.
Can you see anything from that block? What about freezing the geyser under the wheel? Maybe? Hey, looks like you stopped the water flow in that trough. There's a brazier to the left of the chest. Maybe you can light it?
Pardon my blasphemy, but Doom Eternal can also be guilty of this sometimes. Look at this. Now, while a game like Doom Eternal doesn't need as much problem solving as a game like Alan Wake 2 or Disco Elysium, and should let you focus on being the fastest and most efficient demon slayer this side of the solar system, it shouldn't give you a pop-up with an enemy's biggest weakness before you get to fire a single shot. The whole point of playing a game, and interactive art in general, is that thinking about the choices you want to make, regardless of their importance, makes you engage more with it, because it becomes more personal to you. It also makes players feel like they're being talked down to when a game has dialogue like this.
Looks like there are massive clamps holding the shuttle in place. I bet there's a control console nearby.
Or looks like this, and they feel that their intelligence is disrespected. If you turn the communication down from this, you get the sweet spot of communication, not too little and not too much. Good example of this is our Lord and Savior Breath of the Wild, and its weaker but still incredible sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, because they both treat their players with more respect than many R-rated games. It asks you to do X, and it lets you figure out the how by yourself. The sequel especially lets you go wild, and basically sets a new peak for creative expression in games. And that's because it gives you a ton of new tools and lets you use them everywhere, making the quote-unquote cheesing of challenges part of the experience, because in doing so, you grow your knowledge of its mechanics. If you turn down the communication even more, you enter FromSoft territory, and more specifically, Dark Souls territory. All of these games communicate much less than they should be, but the challenge of figuring out everything is part of the joy of these games. Finding your own builds, strategies, routes, and outfits is a lot more fun when a game isn't trying to cram its own ideas down your throat. It only checks for the viability of your strategies by killing you 100 times if your build is bad, and killing you 99 times if your build is good. It sounds really brutal, and it is, but everything's made with such immense passion and attention to detail that their fans don't immediately acquire weapons and shoot everyone in their vicinity. It's a bit of an abusive relationship, yes, but it works because Dark Souls 1 doesn't keep you in the dark too much, gameplay wise. If you go below this level of communication, you enter dangerous territory where the line between wonder and frustrated confusion gets blurry, and that's where Dark Souls 2 is. Using meaningless numbers to illustrate my points, imagine Dark Souls 1's complexity as 70% and its communication as 50%. This means you have to figure out around 20%. Dark Souls 2's biggest weakness is that it ups the complexity dramatically while having even less communication. Instead of a 70-50 relationship, it's closer to a 90-40 relationship. And not knowing half the mechanics in a game is too much to ask for most players. Some examples of this added complexity is changing the whole stat leveling system, most notably by splitting endurance into vitality, equipment load, and endurance, stamina, making your roll invincibility frames dependent on a stat that doesn't even mention them, and it starts you out with less frames than in the previous game, so it's not like this is a random optional buff you can give yourself, and it means that you start off thinking nothing's changed until you realize you get damaged half the times you dodge an attack. It also reduces your maximum health every time you die. Talking about normal deaths, not curses or anything, and the game decides to punish you for playing normally, and weakens you to punish you for being weak. It's a mechanic so egregiously evil that I started to wonder if Hidetaka, devourer of children's souls, Miyazaki's direction, makes games easier. It has a much more open world than Dark Souls 1, with many more branching paths, along with 3 DLC areas, each as big as its predecessor's single DLC. Not complex enough? It also has double the weapons and a ton more spells and armor sets. There's nothing wrong about having a lot of complexity in a game. In fact, it's usually a good thing because it gives players more agency and control of their playstyles. But Dark Souls 2 doesn't communicate most of these changes, so you end up being significantly crippled by 30 mechanics you've never even heard of. And when you don't know why you're dying, you start to resent the game instead of becoming more determined to overcome its challenges, and you end up leaving the game with a bad impression. This is entirely the game's fault. Players shouldn't need to consult the wiki or Reddit to understand the basics of the game. That's poor communication. Nobody minds confusing optional puzzles and secret zones, but you can't lock a player's progression for not understanding things you've never taught them. Despite all these flaws, I played the game recently for the first time and beat it a couple of days ago, and I had an incredible time. This is the plot twist all 12 million of my viewers have probably expected, because I wouldn't make a video just to hate on a game that came out before I made my first billion. I loved Dark Souls 2, and this is why. In my opinion, Dark Souls 2's strongest aspect is its world. It's not as interconnected and cohesive as Dark Souls 1, but it makes up for that by being absolutely beautiful. The different areas of the game have wildly different vibes, yet they all manage to look fantastic and memorable. Even in the duller underground areas, the isolation and darkness are intentional and temporary to get you to miss the open sky and the waves breaking through the sunlit sea. The areas are intuitively designed and a joy to explore, with incredible art direction and atmosphere everywhere. The DLC areas are also great, and each has its own unique atmosphere that's different from anything in the base game. It's amazing how well they executed each area. There's so much variety that it never gets stale. Combat is the bread and butter of FromSoft games, and Dark Souls 2 delivers once you've got your head around the mechanics. There are many viable builds to play around with, and thanks to the massive amount of weapons, there's a lot of ways to play the game. You could use melee, magic, or both to get through the game, and whatever you choose, it'll probably be fun. I personally use the Zweihander because I have no personality, and because it's a lot of fun to run around killing everything with 1 or 2 hits. The enemies are a lot more aggressive than DS1 in my experience, and their attacks sometimes come out really quick, or even more dangerously, be delayed, so you need to constantly pay attention to their movements. While the enemy placement is notoriously bad, even in the updated slash remastered version, Scholar of the First Sin, the enemies themselves are all really well designed visually and they're a lot of fun to fight. You may have noticed I didn't mention the bosses yet, and that's because most of them are easy, forgettable, or both. Some exceptions include the Pursuer, Sir Alon, the Fume Knight, and the Lost Sinner. I also died a million times to the Blue Smelter Demon, and a million more times while running back to him, because this game was made in the pre-good era where statues of Marika didn't exist. The bosses aren't bad, they're just not impressive. They don't make the game better, but they're not bad enough to make the game worse. If you want a game with lots of very good boss fights, stop watching this video and buy Hollow Knight. If it's not a deal breaker for you, still buy Hollow Knight, it's 5 times better than the DS2. Finally, the story is completely incomprehensible. The story is told through weird Shakespearean prose and nonsensical world design. Seriously, this game has a lava lake above a windmill tower. It makes Dark Souls 1 storytelling look as clear and direct as Red Dead 2's. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The reason this type of storytelling works is that players have to come to their own conclusions about everything, and when they're wrong, which they usually will be, it'll seem like a twist rather than them not connecting the dots correctly. A good example of this, and skip to this timestamp if you haven't played the game yet, is that while playing the DLCs, I noticed that each queen was related to Dark, and seeing as Vendrick was mindlessly walking around in a crypt underground, she'd be the final boss. And I was right about that, which was really cool. Having the vaguest story in the world doesn't matter as much as the badly explained gameplay because it's not as important to the moment decision making, and I personally found it appropriate for the forgotten world we explore. It enriches it and makes it feel more real, even if it makes no sense. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really like Dark Souls 2, despite its reputation, so I thought I'd share my opinion to all my 3 billion subscribers. We worked really hard on this video, so I hope you found it interesting or entertaining, and if you did, consider liking or subscribing. Leave your thoughts and suggestions in the comments below, and I'll see you all soon, assuming I haven't given up on this yet.